It is the category of environment and agriculture. Okay, without taking much time, we will move to our first presentation. She'll present by the Andrea Paul. She's presenting from the Perth Hub, and she's presenting about the towards an AI agronomist, fast and efficient method for predicting crop growth. So over to you.
Thank you. Good morning to everybody in Perth and good afternoon to my colleagues in Hobart and Christchurch. I want to begin my presentation by asking you to think about the role of decision making in farming. Minister Dawson set up my talk beautifully yesterday by talking about yield forecasting and resource management. I'm going to set the scene in a little bit more detail by introducing you to someone. If my slides will progress, there we go. This is my dad, Tom. He's been a grains farmer in a small Western Australian community for 40 years after inheriting the farm from his dad. My dad has been finding it increasingly difficult to make good decisions about how to run the farm as the weather in my hometown becomes more severely affected by climate change. It's getting drier. The winter rainfall is breaking much later, and it's hard to know which crops to put in, how much fertiliser to use, or in some years, if it's going to be worth putting crops in the ground at all. While he can and does talk to an agronomist or an agricultural consultant when making these decisions, agronomists aren't equally accessible to everyone. The work that I'm going to present today is a first step towards making a simulation model that is widely used in agricultural research for scenario analysis and yield forecasting, more accessible to the general community, and creating an AI agronomist. This is APSIM. APSIM is the Agricultural Production Systems Simulator. It is a biophysical farm model that uses experimental data and biological principles to simulate crop growth. It is highly validated, accurate, and widely used in agricultural research. However, its accuracy comes at a cost. It requires expert parameterization and must be perturbed to perform scenario analysis or generate uncertainty estimates, which makes it computationally expensive. So how are we going to convert this into something we can give a farmer? The answer, we're going to emulate it. Emulation is a process whereby we overcome the limitations of computationally intense models by substituting them with an efficient surrogate, which has learned the approximate relationships between the inputs and outputs. They are intended to allow rapid what-if scenario analyses and to calculate uncertainty estimates without perturbation. So our project was to build an emulator of APSIM that uses statistical techniques alongside neural networks for exactly those processes, for those purposes. So let me take you through the process. We did our analysis for a single prototype location in Dalby in Queensland. APSIM requires two inputs, a meteorological data set and some management decisions. The trick is that in Australia, we only have around 120 years of annual weather observations. That's nowhere near enough to train a machine learning model to emulate APSIM. So we developed synthetic meteorology. We did that by sampling from our 120-year observations and shifting and rescaling the observations to create a new plausible weather pattern. Rinse and repeat 10,000 times to get 10,000 years of weather. For our management decisions, we consulted an agricultural expert at the CSIRO to give us a set of plausible ranges, and we then used a Latin hypercube sample to select 10,000 sets of management options. We plug both of these into APSIM to get 10,000 simulated runs of APSIM. APSIM produces a lot of output, but we're interested in two things. We're interested in the total wheat weight over the growth of the season, and we're interested in tracking what growth stage the crop is in. Now, we could just plug our time series straight into a neural network and try and predict that. But frankly, the neural network can't do that very well. The target is too large to optimize to. So instead, we've taken the additional step of fitting a growth curve to the AppSim observations. This has two advantages. One, it drastically reduces the size of the target that the neural network has to estimate down to 4 parameters. The D, B, and E parameters from the growth curve. And we've created an additional parameter we call tau, which is the first day at growth stage 10, also known as the date that the crop makes it to harvest maturity. These parameters have a second advantage, which is that they have established interpretations that will potentially be useful for our application of being able to give this to a farmer. Step 3, train the neural network. I don't want to spend too long on the architecture of the neural network, but the way this works is we provide a fully connected neural network with 3 hidden layers with our daily meteorology and our annual management decisions that we use to create the AppSim simulation. We're going to ask the neural network not to give us just the growth curve parameters that it is provided with, but instead we're going to make an extra assumption that those growth curve parameters come from a distribution and that those distributions are normally distributed. We're also going to train our neural network with a log likelihood loss function rather than something like a mean squared error. This allows us to recover the mean and standard deviation parameters for each of the growth curve distributions. And this is how we're going to get uncertainty estimates from our simulated data. The last stage is actually gaining those uncertainty intervals. We've taken a computational approach to do this, whereby we predict the growth curve parameter distributions. We take 100 random draws for each parameter and create candidate parameter sets. For each of those candidates, we calculate the final fitted series as though they were the real growth curve parameters. And each day, we retain the 2.5, 97.5 percentiles, and the median. The median we use as our prediction, and the 2.5 and 97.5 percentiles we use as our confidence interval bounds. What that looks like in practice is this. In the graphs, you'll see a dotted line. That's the original AppSim simulation with the solid line representing our predicted growth curve. For most of the data set, we're able to do this very well. However, there are some exceptions. The bottom 2 simulations show the times when our emulation is failing, and it's failing in characteristic ways. So either it will get the middle of the growth curve right, but it will miss the final wheat weight, or it'll get the final weight right, but it maybe won't capture the growth dynamics in the middle of the season. I'll also note the slide on the right that indicates our ability to predict when harvest maturity is occurring. Our results are reasonable and they're not noticeably biased, but their accuracy could be improved. To put some hard numbers behind that, we can see that our test set results are approaching the training set, but there's still some room to improve the performance. In particular, we need to improve the coverage. Our nominal confidence interval is a 95% confidence interval, but our coverage levels aren't reaching that. So before we roll this out, that's something we need to improve. So what next? We need to take a second look at that synthetic data generation. It's not quite doing the job of capturing the system. We need to have another look at the confidence interval estimation to see if we can improve the coverage. And this is for a single site. If I want to roll this out as an app, I need to be able to do it for an awful lot more than just Dalby and Queensland. So that's my to-do list for my doctoral study starting next year. These are the references that have informed the work that I'm happy to share with everybody. But at the end of the day, we've shown that emulation is a feasible approach, that using curve fitting to reduce the dimension of the target works and adds interpretation, and that we can combine neural networks with statistical simulation to do the uncertainty estimation, but there's more work to do. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andrea, for your nice presentation. And our second presenter is Fiona Scarf. She's joining from the Perth Hub, and she's talking about the where's the best habitat for endangered black cockatoos. Over to you, Fiona.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to tell you about some species distribution modelling that I've been involved with concerning black cockatoos, which are endangered species in rapid decline. You can hear them now. So the ecology team for this work was led by my co-author Jill Shepherd. Chris Warren led the veterinary team, and the other three people here contributed data from their PhD projects. The birds we studied, the work was conducted on Nyungar country, to which the study organisms are largely confined. The birds we studied, the forest redtails that you've just been listening to, and the Carnaby's cockatoos are very important birds within Nyungar culture. So the aim here is to predict the distribution of a species based on its habitat, and that's quite helpful, you can imagine, for understanding impacts of climate change and also to prioritise management interventions. One of our sponsors was particularly interested in understanding where we should best situate reserves. So the general method is to fit a model relating species presence to the local characteristics of the environment, and then project those predictions across maps of present or future habitats. So generally this sort of work is often done just with survey data, but we also had the luxury of 12 years of tracking data to work with. So the publicly available databases of surveys are shown in yellow on the map here, and then we used two types of tags. So one of them was fitted under the tail. It connects to the Argos satellite and runs off a battery. And then as technology improved over the course of the project, we moved to this fitting a second tag, which connects to the GPS satellite network and runs off a solar panel. You can see the solar panel there. So the GPS records are red on the map and blue is the Argos. Even though we followed these guys around for 12 years, so we knew a fair bit about them, we found ourselves a little bit spoilt for choice when it came to actually choosing some predictors. So we started with 116 different spatial layers that we thought might be relevant. We screened them for multicollinearity using our best ecological judgment as to what should be kept. And after that, we then subjected them to some variable selection. We used the lasso, stepwise GLM, and an ensemble of regression trees, Bayesian additive regression trees, and we just allowed those three different methods to compete against each other. There are quite a number of packages available in R for species distribution modelling that are pretty plug and play, but in this project I found myself really grappling with different biases in the data and how to try to control for them. So I'm going to mostly talk about that and the remedies I found rather than the results especially. We only had presence records, but we're trying to compare with the range of environments that the birds could choose, represented by sampling the environmental background from wherever they had access to. So it matters that our birds didn't have access to all possible locations in the study area. They could have flown to anywhere, but they weren't necessarily going to reconnaissance the entire of the southwest of Australia during the period that we tracked them, every individual doing that separately. So we dealt with that by sampling that environmental background just from the vicinity of where the birds were tracked to. Then the spatial accuracy of the Argos tags turned out to be way worse than its advertised accuracy. So we developed this graph here of the spatial error on the tags by looking at the variation in the tracking locations when the birds were sleeping. So we knew they weren't moving around, and we imposed case weights that were reduced on the Argos tags compared to the GPS tags. Yeah, another thing is that some of the birds lost their satellite tags quite quickly, whereas others retained them for many months. And you can imagine there's a potential interaction there between how bushy and twiggy the environment is and how long they keep their tags on for. So we didn't want to get a wrong idea about some environments being unsuitable for the birds, when really they were just unsuitable for the birds to retain the tags, which are our means of observing them. So to try and control for that, I imposed the number of fixes we had on each bird as a covariate. And then the other thing is, it's harder to find the birds in dense forest. So at the stage of technology that these tags were at the time that we were using them, the GPS collars couldn't beam their location data up to the satellite for us to download. Instead, they communicate with the satellite, get a location fix, and then that fix is then stored on board the bird. So to get it off the bird, you have to sneak up on them. Well, firstly, you have to get a rough idea of where they are based on a location provided by the less accurate tag. Then you sneak up on them in the dark, so you can get to within this base station, stuck up in a tree somewhere within 200 metres of where the bird is. And this is another PhD student, Molly Spalding, doing some excellent sneaking. So the thing is, it's hard to sneak up on them in dense forest. They get disturbed and leave before you get there. And it's also the case that in that dense environment, you can't necessarily get a signal on your handheld antenna as to where they are. So we really depended on the public survey records to correct for that. But that database of public survey records was also biased. So potentially, if we don't correct for that, what we're going to get is a distribution model of where this species on the right is, the bird observers. And then also they're going to tend to observe the birds when they're engaged in more conspicuous activities and to observe them in landscapes with a better line of sight. There's also a risk of misidentification. So the two birds you see pictured here are two different species. You can tell them apart by the length of the very tip of their bill. And then we also wound up having to discard a bunch of records because the different survey methods that different people used had varied spatial accuracy, so some of them just weren't suitable for our purposes. So we used what's known as a target group approach to account for observer bias. For the survey data, we drew our background samples not at random from the environment, but based on the locations where other species of birds had been detected. So we knew at least bird observers had been to those places, they'd had the opportunity to see our birds if they were around. And then we combined that with the satellite tracking data in a joint likelihood model. So we could take advantage of the insights from both data sets, correct it as much as possible for the various biases. I used a stat ensemble of these algorithms to predict the distributions. These are precision recall plots. So the line on the plot should be hugging the top right corner. And you can see the GLM and GAM perform rather less well there. Probably, I think, because they're not specifying interactions as well. So the other methods here, maximum entropy models, random forests, boosted regression trees, and Bayesian additive regression trees. So this is the species distribution that's predicted compared to the observed sightings. It seems to fit quite well. So just to sum up there, we had this task to try to understand the habitat requirements of an endangered species, and the data we had to work with was inherently quite biased in a range of different ways. So we tackled that by using multiple sources of data at once to try to cover for the different biases by drawing background samples that reflected the data biases, imposing covariates to control for the habitat effects on tag retention, and addressing the variations in spatial accuracy with case weights and screening. And we also screened the data to avoid some problems there. So started with red tails. I'm going to finish with Carnaby's. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Fiona, for your interesting presentation about the black cockatoos. So our next presenter is Jason Rennie. He's talking about representing bushfire with data, bridging the gap. Sorry. Can't see. Bridging the gap between statistic and the real world. So he's joining from the Hobart Hub. So over to you.
Hello. I'm a data scientist working in the bushfire and forest services within the Victorian government. I'm going to be talking to you about feature generation. This specifically in the context of spatial datasets for machine learning in the bushfire domain. And so this is one of the more important and complicated parts of my role as a data scientist. And if you want your data and statistics work to make a positive real world impact, I highly recommend to develop this skill set. So the questions we're going to be looking at are, how can you represent bushfires in numbers, and what decisions do you have to make when choosing model input variables? First, let's look at the problem context. So this is the basic sequence of events of a bushfire response. First of all, a fire is somehow ignited in the landscape, such as by lightning, and then it spreads based on weather, terrain, and fuel conditions. The fire is then detected and reported to emergency services. First attack response is sent out to find the fire, and first attack just means the first people sent out to the fire. Then those firefighters have to find and access the fire. And after that, they can either contain the fire, or if the first attack is unsuccessful, then they might have to send additional resources. And so the modeling context that we're looking at today is this last one. We want to model the probability that the fire will be contained in first attack. And this will be based on how the fire spreads, how quickly it will be detected, and how difficult it is to access. And so there are a lot of complications in this, and so the main one I want to highlight is that the data that we use for fires is operational data, meaning that was not collected for machine learning purposes. The location the fire location is not the ignition point of the fire, but rather the location that the firefighters use to locate the fire. And so that means it could be like, for example, a landmark or a property address. And so we have to account for up to 3 kilometers of error. And then of course, fires also spread, they don't stay in the same place. So we want to look at an area around our point, not just the point. And so what we do to account for this is look at features in a 3 kilometer radius around the point, as you can see in this diagram. And so I'm going to go through 3 examples of spatial datasets and how we generate features for those for this model context. And I just want you to keep in mind, like think to yourself, for each example, how would you represent that feature or that concept? And so the first one we're looking at is a digital elevation model, which represents the terrain height at a point. And of course, terrain height doesn't tell us much about how difficult it is to access a fire. So we want to look at basically how bumpy the area is around the fire. So like, is it flat or mountainous? And like, how difficult would it be to get a vehicle there? So a common way to do this is the terrain ruggedness index that you can see here. It's just a pretty simple calculation with a sum of square differences. And this is the difference between a cell and the surrounding 8 cells, as I've like kind of illustrated here. And this is a pretty simple and intuitive way to represent how rugged the terrain is. But the problem that we have is that our data is 30-meter resolution. And so if we just put it into this calculation, we'll only get to see the ruggedness within 30 meters of the point. But we need to look at 3 kilometers, right? So to illustrate this, you can see this picture here. If a fire started in like one of these paddocks, you would want to be able to represent that there's all these hills and mountains nearby. So how do we do that? It's pretty complicated, and we had to think quite a lot about the best way to approach this, but here are 3 options we considered. The first one is to use a more complex calculation using more cells. And this is actually just not very straightforward to come up with a new calculation for this. And it's also, the more complex it is, the more difficult it is to interpret. So it's not an ideal choice because we want to have something that's pretty interpretable. The second option is to reduce the resolution of the elevation data before doing the calculation. But when you reduce the resolution of spatial data, you tend to lose important information, so that's also not ideal. And then the last option, which is one we chose, you can just take the ruggedness for each cell in the area and then take the average. And we chose this because it's relatively simple and also interpretable. And the next example is fuel type. So in this context, fuel type means like the vegetation type. And these fuel categorizations can get pretty complex, like grassy woodlands and hardwood plantations and things like that. But we don't need that level of detail for our context. We just use these high-level vegetation types, which are grass, forest, shrub, and no vegetation. And you can kind of see an example here. And so the first step for us to get this into a number for our model was to take the pixel density around in this area, which is basically just the percentage of cells of that type. And so you can see here in this example, this one is 10% grass in the yellow and 88% forest in the green. And we can also use this to separate our data into 2 data sets and train 2 models, a grass fire model and a forest fire model. And this comes from domain knowledge. So we know that these 2 fire types behave very differently. So forest fires are harder to access, so they take longer to bring under control. Whereas grass fires spread very fast, so they burn a much larger area. And then our last example is roads, and this is from a road data set of road networks in Victoria, and the data is in vectors. So you can see that it's very easy to understand in a map format, in a visual format, but how can we represent this as a number that tells us something about accessing the bushfire? So we have two physical concepts that we're representing here. One is road proximity, which is the distance between the fire and the nearest road. And then the other one is road density, which is basically how much road access is there in the area as a whole. And so I'm going to be talking about the second one here. And so the first thing we did was similar to the fuel. So we took a pixel density of what percentage of the area contains roads with cells. But that we found out that that didn't perform very well in the model, and it's also not very intuitive or interpretable. So we chose to instead look at road length, so the total number of kilometers in the area, which we found to be more intuitive. Okay, and so in conclusion, we've looked at 3 different examples and how to represent them. So what I'd like you to take away from this is, first of all, think carefully about what your input data means. So ask yourself, does this variable actually mean what I think it means? The best choice of representation for a variable is generally not obvious. You actually have to make a choice, and that choice will impact the results. You should definitely make use of expert domain knowledge. You're not expected to know everything, so ask questions. Not everything can be appropriately represented. So for example, with down power lines and trees, we wanted to incorporate that in our model because it's very important for fire access, but it's just not really possible. And then lastly, you just have to accept that sometimes information will be missing from your model. If you find that your model just doesn't work because of that, my advice is to be humble and accept failure and take it as a learning experience. So thank you.
Thank you, Jason, for your important work on representing bushfires with data. So okay. Our next presenter is Lakma Gunaratna. She's joining from the Hobart Hub, and he's talking about the impact of intimate partner violence on mental health among married women in Sri Lanka. So, Lakma, over to you.
Hello everyone. Thank you all for joining me today, both in person and online. Before starting the presentation, first I would like to acknowledge and respect the traditional owners of the land and their elders, both past and present. I'm Lakma Gunaratna. Today I'm going to present a study that we conducted to investigate the impact of intimate partner violence on mental health among married women in Sri Lanka. This is the part of my PhD as well. And here's the outline of today's presentation. Let me first begin it by giving brief background of this matter. What is intimate partner violence? Intimate partner violence refers as any act or behavior by intimate partner that causes physical, sexual, or psychological harm. According to World Health Organization, if we consider 3 women in age between 15 to 49 years, one becomes a victim of intimate partner violence. Therefore, it is a significant global issue, especially among women, regardless of whether they are living in developing or developed countries. At the global level, the prevalence rate of intimate partner violence is on average 30%. However, this is much more higher in low and middle income countries. Sri Lanka is one of low and middle income countries in South Asian region affected by intimate partner violence, with 1 in every 5 married women reported experience of any form of violence by their husband. So it is a widespread public health concern in Sri Lanka, especially among married women. There are several factors associated with intimate partner violence, among them level of education, decision-making ability, age at marriage, living area, gender inequality, poverty, norms on acceptability of violence are the most common factors associated with intimate partner violence. Furthermore, it has more serious short-term as well as long-term negative physical and psychological impacts on women, including severe injuries, unwanted pregnancies, poor mental health conditions like anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, self-harm, suicidal attempts, and problems with alcohol and drug use. Not only that, but also 40 to 70% of female homicide victims were killed by their intimate partners. Therefore, it becomes a critical factor of women's mortality as well. All these consequences of intimate partner violence can be experienced not just by women themselves, but also their children, families, and entire community. Therefore, it is really important to look at this matter. While Sri Lanka has reported a high prevalence rate of intimate partner violence, there's only limited study investigating the impact of intimate partner violence on women's mental health well-being. Therefore, this study aimed at addressing this critical gap by looking at the relationship between experience of intimate partner violence and its negative mental health outcome by considering the latest data available in Sri Lanka. Now, I would like to show the methodology of this study. We analyzed the data of 1,611 married women who participated in the 2019 Women Wellbeing Survey. This was a nationwide cross-sectional survey covering all 25 districts in Sri Lanka. We considered 2 outcome variables, one as married women mental health status, whether it is healthy or not healthy, based on Kessler Psychological Distress Score, and the second outcome variable was whether married women having suicidal thoughts or not. Therefore, both outcome variables are binary. Mental health is influenced by multiple factors, not only experience of intimate partner violence. Therefore, based on past literature and the availability of the variables in this survey, we consider several covariates, including level of education, living area, number of children, and so on. For statistical analysis, we conducted descriptive analysis to outline the distribution of the variables. Then 2 separate complex survey-weighted logistic regression models were fitted to each outcome variables to find out the factors associated with them. Results were concerning. Among studied women, 26% reported experience of any form of violence by their husband. Even more alarming, 30% reported poor mental health, and 14%, that is nearly 1 in 7 women, had suicidal thoughts. These forest plot display the results of complex survey-weighted logistic regression models. Here you can see, even after controlling for other possible factors associated with mental health well-being, experiencing intimate partner violence remains a critical factor, as married women who experience intimate partner violence are 3 times more likely to have poor mental health compared to those who are not experiencing intimate partner violence. Similarly, the likelihood of having suicidal thought is 6 times higher for married women who experience intimate partner violence compared to their counterparts. Furthermore, these findings highlight some protective factors in reducing the risk of having poor mental health outcomes, including high level of education and greater involvement in decision making. Let's turn to the conclusion of this oral study. This finding clearly shows that married women who are exposed to intimate partner violence are at a higher risk of having poor mental health and suicidal thoughts. This might be due to stress and fear of ongoing violence, which can lead to having chronic mental health conditions like anxiety and depression. Furthermore, in low and middle income countries, social and cultural norms often blame victim, causing shame, guilt, self-blame, which discouraging women from seeking help. This results in social isolation, loss of support, and depression. Therefore, there's a need for a greater awareness and effective intervention efforts to address intimate partner violence and its negative mental health outcomes. This study identified high level of education and greater involvement in decision making as protective factors. Therefore, interventions aim at increasing educational opportunities and promoting gender equality might be effective in reducing the risk of having mental health outcomes associated with intimate partner violence. Furthermore, intervention should focus on providing mental health support services such as counseling, trauma-informed treatment for victimized women, because such services might helpful in managing the mental health challenges associated with intimate partner violence. Accessible legal support to victimized women is really important to make sure that they have resources they need to secure their safety and seek justice. Comprehensive policies and targeted intervention are really important to address intimate partner violence and support the victimized women, because in turn it contributes to achieving Sustainable Development Goal 5.2, which aim at eliminating all forms of violence against women and girls by 2030. Finally, while this provides some invaluable insight, there are some limitations to consider. This study used cross-sectional data, so causal interpretation cannot be made. Furthermore, this study only focuses on married women, because those who are the most vulnerable population to intimate partner violence, which limit the generalizability of finding to other populations. Factors like severity, frequency, and duration of intimate partner violence, which might impact mental health outcomes, were not evaluated in this study. As well, effectiveness of interventions and interventions aim at preventing intimate partner violence and enhancing women's mental health was not evaluated. These limitations underscore several directions for further research, so future research should focus on identifying the factors associated with women's education, empowerment, and how these factors collectively influence to mitigate the mental health consequences of intimate partner violence. And this study highlighted the need for a longitudinal study which helped establish causal relationship between intimate partner violence, education, empowerment, and mental health outcomes among women. So to wrap up, intimate partner violence against women is a critical global issue. While the study only investigates its impact on mental health, considering the married women in Sri Lanka, finding have broader relevance. So this insight can significantly inform and contribute to addressing intimate partner violence in other countries as well. Now, I would like to take this moment to thank Department of Census and Statistics in Sri Lanka for providing data for this study. I would like to extend my gratitude to my principal supervisor, Associate Professor Johar, and my co-supervisors, Professor Maya and Dr. Prahan, for their invaluable support in this project. I would like to thank Swinburne University of Technology for offering me a tuition fee scholarship to support my PhD, as well as sponsoring me to attend this conference. Finally, conference organizers, thank you very much for providing me this opportunity to present my work. These are the references of today's presentation, and thank you very much you all for your time and attention. Thank you.